So good morning, everybody. Welcome to our guest speaker session of the graduate course on men and masculinities taught at the Department of Sociology at the Faculty of Social Studies, Masaryk University in Brno. I'm really very glad that Professor Jeffa Hearna was willing to give us a talk on violence and digital violence and men and masculinities. Jeffa Hearna is a long-term collaborator and mentor of me, so I will not make much fuss, but give the room to him. The arrangement of this session is that there should be room for questions and discussion roughly in the middle and towards the end. The whole session is planned for 100 minutes, but I believe you will, we will have time to have some more interactive bits and pieces in between. So that's the arrangement. Please use chat for your questions also. We will be reading and I will be making notes. And we will see how this works. We are open and flexible for that. So, Jeff, the floor is yours.
Okay. Yeah, thanks a lot, Eva. It's really nice to be invited. It's really nice to, it's always nice to work with you. We've worked together, I don't know, on and off, I forget, maybe 15 years, I don't know. It's quite a long time anyway, quite a long time. Just one thing, I can't see the chat at the moment unless I change the screen. So yeah, as you say, if you want to watch the chat, and then any comments can be passed on or paraphrased, if that's all right. And yeah, well, I mean, this is what I'm going to try and talk about initially for the next half hour, then we'll have a little break and discussion. I mean, I'm happy people also to interrupt as well, but yeah, we can play this by ear because I'm going to try and talk about these very large questions. And I should say I live in Helsinki, but I'm also linked with some other parts of the world, including South Africa actually as well. And I'm going to say a little bit about these things. So this is my rough outline, a little bit about critical studies of men and masculinities. And as I gather it, the whole of this course is on that area. So this will be very quick. Then say something more about violence and particularly violence against known women. And then after that, we'll have a little break or discussion. And then the second part will be more on digital violence. And as I put here, if you can see the screen, that's with colleagues, Matthew Hall, I say with, I mean, it's from work with them. I mean, they're not going to be here today, I don't think. Although you never know, they might appear. Matthew Hall and Ruth Lewis, who are both based in the UK, although Matthew is just actually also working for the British University, Egypt, as it happens. So just to go straight into this and to talk a little bit, maybe only for a few minutes, on critical studies on men and masculinity. And I mean, this is a very big area and you're discussing it and reading about it on your course. And so some of this, I guess, is obvious or maybe not. I mean, one is to say this is not new. It's not a new area of study. It's been going on for a long time. And you could also argue a lot of social science is actually about men studying men. Studying men and masculinity in itself is no guarantee of criticality. I mean, there's some really non-critical studies. You can reread the so-called founding fathers of sociology, for instance, or of psychology or psychoanalysis. The issue of the man question has figured long in feminism. And then one other thing at the bottom is I think it's quite interesting to think about talking about men as subjects of research, like doing research, and men as objects of research. This is something often that's somehow confused, I think. Okay, these are just 4 quick thoughts. I also say, I mean, you say these will be posted. I can send these, well, Eva has got these PowerPoints, so you can share them afterwards or whatever. And again, in terms of this critical studies, I mean, there are a number of major things to say. This is an explicit or specific focus on men and masculinities in a gendered way, looking at also variations across time and space and within given societies and across the life course and biographies. I'm pretty interested in the issue of age. I've just done a book called Age at Work with Wendy Parkin, my 84-year-old colleague. So age and gender, I think, is a fantastically important question. And then relations to power, both materially and discursively. So the relation of materiality and discourse is a central issue. And of course, everyone now talks about intersectionality, although this isn't exactly a new topic either. Then, in terms of what's often been called masculinity theory, particularly as developed by Raewyn Connell, I mean, again, I'm sure this is familiar to you. This is my attempt to summarize, 30, 40 years on one PowerPoint. And I won't go through all the points here in any detail. I think perhaps just to pick up a couple of, one is that Raewyn Connell's initial work was actually done in the field of the body. The first reference I know of to hegemonic masculinity was in a paper called Men's Bodies. So again, body theory is not something discovered in the last 2 or 3 years. And also the critique of sex role theory. And then perhaps one of the other things to say is that this notion of different masculinities in the plural, hegemonic, complicit, subordinated, and so on, I think it's very important to think about hegemonic masculinity as not being like a fixed type, that it is something which is contested and takes different forms in different times and places, rather than say some fixed type. And this is often, I think, misrepresented in my understandings. And then perhaps the last point, perhaps to pick up on very strongly, which was recognized by Connell and Messerschmitt in an important article in 2005, is the issue of what you might loosely call spatiality, both local spatiality and broader spatiality, including transnational and global processes that affect masculinities in different ways. Just as a personal comment, my first degree was in geography, actually, a long while ago in the 60s. And once you get interested in geography, space and place, they never vanish. So I think thinking about how these issues work, I mean, a very concrete example, I think, is not to do with globalization. Well, it is indirectly to do with globalization, is the difference between, say, urban and spatial, or urban-rural, I should say, urban and rural relationships around masculinity. And rural masculinities, to use that term, is still, I would say, somewhat neglected as an area, just as older masculinities are still somewhat neglected compared with younger and those of middle years. Okay, and then this is the final thing I'm going to say about this first quick part, is that, I mean, I've been interested for quite a long time in the issue of hegemony, and hegemony relates not only to masculinities, but also I think it's worth reflecting on how hegemony connects to the question of men, and how men are constructed in a sort of double way. So the social category of men is formed within the gender system, but also men individually and collectively sort of do social practices. And this is also relevant for thinking about violence, which is the main topic today. And I mean, just to give an example of this, I mean, the whole debate around transgender, which has become much, much more public, you could say, much more visible, not least through the internet, actually, is something that problematizes the category of men in a way that has been discussed quite a long time in terms of the category of women. The category of women has been contested and discussed in feminist theory for quite a long time, but the category of men hasn't always been so contested. Okay, that's my quick round of 40 years in four PowerPoints. In terms of some general points. I hope it made some sense, but of course we can come back to these things if you're interested. The second thing, and the main thing I want to talk about then for this rest of the first half hour, and I've asked Eva to keep track of time because I might otherwise just go on much too long, is to think about the relationship of men and masculinities to violence, and specifically violence against known women. This might sound a bit of an unusual turn of phrase, violence against known women, but it's a term that's been used with my colleague Jeffa Hearna since at least the early 90s and probably earlier, as against violence to, say, stranger women. But again, just to sort of step back a little bit and to think about the question of how this general discussion on men and masculinities critically, as just glossed over in 4 PowerPoints, relates to violence. And I mean, this could be a very long discussion, but it won't be because of the time. But when one thinks about the question of violence, the point is there are so many different forms of violence, ranging from, you could say, world wars or genocide or torture, I don't know, civil conflicts, through to threatening somebody through looking at somebody in a certain way, should we say. So, I mean, there are many, many ways in which violence and non-violent men and masculinities are topics that are really important. And again, I'm going to rush through some of these points. Men are members of a social category invested with power in different ways in different societies, if only by association. And that could include being reproduced by violence. Some men are specialists or experts in violence. This might seem a strange thing to say, and the main doers of violence, to women, children, to each other, to non-humans, to the self, which again, one might argue about, violence to the self. Some of these violences reinforce each other. There are intersections of sexuality and violence in different ways. Violence can be an accepted way, if not acceptable, of being a man. But of course, this again varies in different ways. It can be a reference point, even if one says, I'm a non-violent man. It's a reference point for constructions of masculinity. There's obviously the whole issue of what you might call violent institutions and state control of violence, whether it's military or whether it's police systems in some cases and so on. And some people would argue that violence is the center of certain kinds of patriarchal relations. That's obviously very debatable. And then there's a huge area of the relationship of violence in what you call media, sport, film, fantasy, online, digital world, and so on. But this is the last couple of points. Men and violence are not equivalent. I think that's an important thing to say. And some men are definitely anti-violence, at least in public statements. So there's a lot of questions here one can actually one could write a course essay on any one of these points, I think, for instance. I don't know how your course is organized. Okay, to try and focus a little more on violence against women, and I presume you're all at least know of, but if you don't, it's probably worth looking at the what's called the Fundamental Rights Agency EU study in 2015. Sorry, it was published in 2015. It was conducted actually over the 2 previous years, which gives some information in the EU, at least, in terms of quite a large number of respondents, women respondents. Again, I won't read this through, but 1 in 10 women talking about some form of sexual violence since 15, 1 in 20 raped. This is from women's responses, not from police reports, which is quite a different issue. And at the bottom of the page, one has these, this is obviously glossing over the whole of the EU, and there are big debates about the interpretation of this study, which I can talk about if you're interested. 14% reported the most serious incident of intimate partner violence to the police. 13% reported the most serious incident of non-partner violence to police. So you can make the calculation there. What's that? 1 in 6, 1 in 7, 1 in 8. So policing reports, official reports, if you like, are only 1 because they're tip of the iceberg. It just as a very short aside, I've been involved the last 3 years or so in a project which we call Violence Regimes. It's funded by the Swedish Research Council. It's led by Sophia Strid with Anne-Laure Humbert, Dag Balkamar, and myself. And we've published, I think, so far 3 articles which are basically discussing this whole European-wide set of data. One is just published online with the journal PLOS One, just published, I think, last week, actually. There's another one in the Journal of European Social Policy, another one in Social Politics, if people are interested in this area of work. Okay, men's violence against women, what is it? Well, I mean, again, there's a lot of different things one can talk about here. I mean, one could even reflect, what is your image? I should perhaps also have said at the beginning, sorry, I should have said also, talking about these issues is, it's different perhaps talking now online to talking face to face, but I mean, you're listening, hopefully, and these are very powerful and very emotional issues, and people, individual people and people together have different relations, I should say, to violence. And this can be a very distressing, I mean, to say perhaps a very distressing area. So I'm aware of that, and I hope that is taken care of by you and your friends and colleagues, and the course as well. This is a bit difficult when one's online and can't even see people. But to acknowledge that point, people have different previous and other experiences, or experiences from their best friend or whatever, or family experiences. But the point I want to make here is that when one says men's violence against women, perhaps certain ideas come to mind, certain images, even images you might have seen, say, on some film, on television. It might involve direct hitting, but there are other things to be aware of, like damaging property or damaging pets, even killing pets. Yeah, are also forms of violence, as well as sexual violence, sexual coercion, pressurized sex, and so on. And violence of this kind can be minimal, so to speak. It can be something happening in 10 seconds, never again, or it can be extensive and life-threatening. It can be one-off, it can be sporadic, it can be constant, it can be systematic, it can be random. And it can also connect in different ways with, say, child abuse as well. So this, again, is a huge range of things to digest, as well as, of course, online violence that we'll come to a bit later. Yeah, depending how you ask or do studies of this kind of area, you get different kinds of answers. If you ask people, have you ever been hit by your partner? That kind of thing. And just like a yes, no, there is the whole question of so-called gender symmetry. And not to say that it's equal, but particularly with younger people, you may find more similar percentages in answering, like, have you ever been hit by your partner? But of course, being hit can mean many, many different things in terms of the damage and the meaning of that. But if one talks about, it says here ESP, meaning especially if one talks about planned violence, and I mean that, planning of violence, heavy repeated violence, which is physically damaging, non-defensive violence, sexual violence, premeditated, non-retaliatory, bit of a difficult word in English, or multiple forms of violence, then there's clear gender asymmetry. In other words, men do far more to women than vice versa, which is very different to asking someone, have you ever been hit? And of course, then there are other forms as well, economic violence, whereas collective violence, institutional military violence, which also, of course, can be interpersonal, direct. Okay, this is in fact, I have the book here, so I'm going to wave it at you. That's like, Patrick can't see me anyway, so it doesn't matter. This, in the early 90s, I conducted a study with colleagues where we interviewed 75 men who had used violence to known women they knew, often partners. It was a very difficult study to do, and the book called The Violences of Men was published in 1998. There was a parallel study on women's experiences of violence with Jeffa Hearna, my colleague. We also did a lot of follow-ups with agencies that the men had dealt with, including men's programs, men's group programs mainly. this was a major experience doing this kind of work, and I could talk about it for hours. But it was sitting down, you know, face to face, could say across the table or whatever, interviewing men about this. And before doing it, we didn't know how to do it, basically. It was one of the first studies in the UK of its kind, if not the first, in community situations, not men in prison or men in clinical situations, but men living in the community. Although we did interview a few men in prison because we wanted to interview men who had killed, but most of the men hadn't killed, but actually, apart from those few, all the men were living, in a sense, in their own homes, either with women sometimes or sometimes on their own or with others. Yeah, and again, trying to summarize a lot of material. The women that Jeffa Hearna interviewed about their experiences from men talked about violence in a very, very, you could say, deep and detailed and complex way, where forms were sometimes separate and sometimes merged, if that makes sense. So there was physical violence, threats, so sexual violence, emotional violence, verbal violence, psychological, control of economy, food, reproduction, friends, family, and so on. A very sort of embedded way of talking about violence that was part of their life, unfortunately, or had been part of their life in some cases. When we interviewed the men who had used violence, talking about violence, they had a very different way of talking about it. They talked about it more as incidents that were somehow more separated off from the rest of everyday life. I mean, not in every case, but I would say in the overwhelming number of cases, that's the way they talked about it. Physical violence that was more than a push that didn't count. They talked about legal convictions. That was important. That was a way of structuring the way of talking about violence. That if the law became involved, particularly if they were convicted, that was a sort of like a milestone. Violence that was like to cause physical damage and was visible and lasting was also specifically focused on. And then there was perhaps a rather surprising separation of what was then called violence, meaning physical violence, from the sexual. So the violence was not seen as sexual and was not talked about in terms of, say, pressurized sex or coercive sex. And there was a separation of violence against women and child abuse, which is very different from many of the women's accounts of their experience. These are just a couple of, well, the phrase I'm not a violent man was a phrase I came to almost wait for and hate, because then I remember one particular interview where a man began the interview saying, "I'm not a violent man," and then detailed over 30 specific so-called incidents or occasions in the space of an hour and a quarter interview or so, which was quite rapid. The word just was used quite a lot, like I just did this, I just did that. The word just had, and of course in English, just has a kind of multiple meanings of sort of justice and only, if you follow me. So it's a kind of, in that one word, a lot was being said in some cases. This is a quote from a man actually who had no connection with the law at all. "I wasn't violent, but she used to do my head in," meaning annoy him that much. "I picked her up twice and threw her against the wall and said, 'Just leave it. That's the only violence I put towards her. I've never struck a woman, never, and I never will. But when I held her, I did bruise her somewhere on the shoulder. And she tried making out that I'd punched her, but I never did. I never to this day touched a woman.'" This quote, I mean, one could spend an hour discussing this quote actually, because within it, there are 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 different clauses, if you're interested in language analysis, which actually are very complicated and contradictory and sort of nested with each other. So it means this study was both about general sociological analysis and even policy analysis and policy development, because we interviewed police and lawyers and social workers and men's program workers, leaders, but it was also about looking at how violence was talked about and constructed in language. And this was a kind of a classic example of a particularly complex way of talking, of somebody who had no contact with the police and defined himself as, I'd never touched a woman. Touched meaning hit in this case, I think. Another sort of, I mean, this book, which is, well, if you're interested, goes into these issues in quite a lot of detail. One can also talk about violence operating in what may be constructed as loving relationships or caring relationships. This, again, might sound very odd, but for some men, that was one way of talking, not perhaps the majority. This is a quote, "I don't know. I'll tell you when I find out myself." He was trying to explain his own violence. "I just don't honestly know. I can't." Pauses. "I just can't work out that, right? I really can't. Maybe, and I mean, this is just the thought, but maybe it's because I loved her so much. I didn't want to lose her, you know. To me, that was a way of keeping her," meaning being violent, you know, by keeping her in check. It could be something like that. So this is another sort of rather graphic example of a way of actually explaining the violence to himself. Explanations. Okay, I want to check about the time at this point. Yeah, okay, I'll try and wind up this bit fairly soon, if that's right, Eva. Not quite. There's obviously a huge, sorry, is that okay? 5 minutes?
Perfect, yeah, 25 minutes now, so we have 5 minutes.
That's great, yeah, okay. It's hard to keep track of everything. I mean, there's obviously a very, very lot of debate here about explanations, right? I mean, I think it's fair to say that a lot of research within psychology and even criminology has focused on individual psychologies. And of course, we're talking about a range of different kinds of situation of different individuals with very different histories in some cases. In some cases, multiple problems and so on. So individual, if you like, individualistic approaches are definitely one approach, and that may be relevant in some cases, definitely. Then there's the whole issue of what you might loosely call socialization experiences of boys and men, how in different situations, different parts of the world even, there are different kinds of ways of which boys and men are brought up, which may include expecting to be violence or legitimating violence. And then more broadly, sort of adult subcultures of men. And this gets you into the whole question of mutual relations between men and what is sometimes called peer support between men. And there's some very interesting work, particularly by, I always find it hard to remember his name, De Casederi and Schwartz in the US, on peer support between men being one of the main issues to think about in terms of perpetuation of violence against women. Like friends can actually either support or go along with knowing their friend or best friend is being violent. Then we have obviously more sort of structural approaches, more patriarchal structural approaches, and also perhaps increasingly trans-societal process, which includes then digital issues we'll come to in a moment. And again, come back to this issue of place and space and location. I mean, Susan Edwards, actually, she and I worked together in the early 2000s, I think, wrote this in 1989. The safest place for men is the home. The home is, by contrast, the least safe place for women. It's a kind of powerful summing up of the issue of location, space, and place. So even men who are being violent quite a lot, the actual place or the choice of place, to use choice, might be very significant. They may not be being violent, say, in the supermarket. They might be, but it's perhaps less likely in the supermarket than it is in the kitchen. There's a lot of work on risk factors. This is from a bit old, from 2001, from Walby and Myhill. Previous domestic assault, separation being particularly risky and dangerous time, gender inequality in relationships, poverty and social exclusion, women's employment status, pregnancy, Yeah, and so on. I mean, there's ways of thinking about this. There's also, of course, the critique of risk factors as well, as a way of thinking about this question. I also want to mention here the images studies. Images is the International Men and Gender Equality Studies that's been organized over the last 10 years or so, particularly outside the global north and outside Europe. And this is one summation from Brazil, Chile, Mexico, India, Bosnia, Croatia, Congo, and Rwanda, looking at predictors of men's gender equality, G is gender equality attitudes, including educational attainment, mother's education, reports of fathers' participation at home, background, family, not witnessing violence to the mother. So this is like positive, you might say. And then looking at how gender equality attitudes lead on or predict at a very sort of general level, not individually, obviously, men's more gender equality practices, more participation in childcare, more satisfied with primary relationship, and less interpersonal violence. So this is a very different kind of way of thinking about things at a very general level to the more individualistic approach that I hinted at earlier. And then the last thing I'd say, and then we have this little mini break or discussion, there's some very interesting work by Gondorf and Heckert. There's two articles, 2003 and 2004, which look at, well, women's predictions of risk of violence from their partners were by themselves better predictors than several established psychological risk measures. So if you're interested in that, to actually ask women what is their own estimation of risk of violence is actually perhaps a good thing to do, rather than always relying on sort of psychological measures. Michael Flood, who is very active in Australia in this area, particularly in anti-violence, where a persistent challenge is how to simultaneously involve men on one hand and avoid colluding, reinforcing male privilege on the other. So that's about more the dilemmas or contradictions of what men do in relation to this, both in science, in research, but also in activism and policy development, and some of the sort of contradictions around that. Okay, so this is my quick 28 minutes on the first part, and I apologize if it was too quick or too schematic, but I wanted to say some of these things. And I just thought, well, this is one question, which I think is worth asking, whatever level you're working at, whether you're talking to people in, say, a school who would say 15 or 16, or whether you're doing a first-year undergraduate class on sociology, or whether you're doing doctorates or postdoc, what kind of studies are needed on men, masculinities, and violence? I mean, bearing in mind, violence also is a very, very broad concept. And actually, in the study on violence regimes that I mentioned earlier with Sophia Strid and colleagues in Sweden, based in Sweden, one of the things we work on is actually what is violence, which is it's a really, really hard question to answer, but we try and take a very broad view in that project, including issues around, say, violence to non-humans or violence, ecological violence, and so on. Okay, I'm going to pause and have a little about rest, but a little pause. Back to Eva. Do you want to say anything at this point, or if you can hear me?
Thank you. I can hear you. Thanks also for the perfect timing, and I totally understand that the issue is very heavy and complex too. And I admire how you could summarize all the things into such a short time, which you of course reflect on. I just wrote a short message to the chat to everybody. Maybe also, have you yourselves come across any study that was on violence, and you kind of thought that, well, a perspective on men and masculinities is missing there, where the gaps are? I'm not asking the question necessarily to you, Jeff, but maybe everybody in who has joined this session today. We both at our department, in your research or studies of different programs, have you ever thought, anybody of you, on a needed topic gap where we could target masculinities and violence, whichever of your voluntary work and others. Please share this with us. I also cannot see everybody, so just start talking. I believe we will sort it.
I see Veronica and I see Peter with a flower behind you as well.
Excuse me, I was actually typing in a question into the chat. Would that be better, or can I ask like this?
Yeah, because unless I go out of the PowerPoints, I can't see the chat at the moment, at least. Yeah.
Okay. So. Okay, so I can ask like this. Well, Professor Hearn, thank you very much for your lecture.
Yeah, by the way.
Thank you. I was wondering, just regarding this question actually as well, I was wondering if you are familiar with any comprehensive studies on men's negotiation of the concept of consent with sex, because that seems to be a huge issue with campaigning as well. I came across some national case studies, Nordic case studies concerning young men and boys. And it seems that there is some negotiation among them with neoliberal concepts of individualized responsibility, but also concepts of virility and masculinity, how a man is supposed to behave concerning sexual relations. So if you can talk about this, what is your experience on this?
I think this is a very important question. There's a lot one could say about this, but I mean, again, trying to be to the point. I mean, going back to what I said about interviewing men, the 75 men, there was an overriding tendency to separate what they called violence and sex or sexuality. And so I mentioned issues like what have become called, you know, pressurized sex or coercive sex, which of course has become so high profile, not least through Me Too and similar movements in the last, 3 or 4 or 5 years, online movements as well. So that connection, in a sense, is really very important. But in terms of actual studies, is what you were asking, I think particularly, there was a set of studies done in the UK, and I'm trying to remember roughly when they were. I think around the late 1990s. With people like Janet Holland and Caroline Ramazanoglu and several others. And they produced a book called The Male in the Head, right? The Male in the Head, which if you can get hold of it, I'd recommend, which was on this kind of issue specifically. And then jumping up to the current time, there is a project that's ongoing, which I'm involved in the advisory group of. I'm not part of it in Finland. The project is called COCO, C-O-C-O, which I think stands for Contested Consent specifically. And that is based in Tampere University in Finland. I mean, any of these things, if you email me, I can give you information more properly. But that's an ongoing project, which I recommend focusing on young people specifically. And then in terms of more individual researchers, there's a researcher called Matthew Waits, which is spelled W-A-I-T-E-S, who's been working on consent and sexual consent probably for 25 years and has produced a book specifically. He's worked quite a lot on same-sex consent, actually, but not only that, but I mean, his book published a few years ago, he's written more than one thing, obviously, is a more up-to-date sort of focus on consent itself. And then, of course, the whole issue of, Me Too, there's the handbook of the politics of Me Too, which I recommend very strongly, which I can go and get from the other room if you're interested in a moment. And the whole issue of how consent also, I think, has become changed through the digital world, because, I mean, consent also then links directly to what we talk about in the next part 2, which is things like consent, not only in terms of physical direct sex or sexuality, but also in terms of non-consensual use of, say, photographs or images as well. So consent is also obviously about not only face-to-face or in real life, as it's called, but also consent online, very, very importantly. But I mean, just to repeat, if you're interested in this more generally, I mean, this is just 3 or 4 things, then email me and I can be a bit more specific if that's what you're interested in or are working on.
Thank you so much. I took some notes. I would be only interested in knowing what's the title of that Me Too book you were referring to.
Yeah, it's a handbook. It's a Routledge published the handbook. It's called, I think, The Handbook of the Politics of the Me Too Movement. It's very big. I've done a chapter on it, sorry, a chapter in it on men and Me Too, which again, I can probably send if you email me. I can't send the whole book. It's edited by Chandra and Erlingsdottir, who is they're both in Iceland. Chandra is originally from India, I think. Erlingsdottir, who I think Eva knows, I think is Icelandic, and it came out early this year. There's also, if you go to their website, you'll find the online videos of the launch of the book, I think, as well. But I mean, this is hard to give the information like this, but it can be found very easily.
Thank you. I'm gonna go Google now. Thank you.
But email me because I can send the stuff more efficiently than just listing and describing. But it's a big area, absolutely big area, and I think it's very topical. I think the COCO project, the leader of that, it's a difficult name, is Professor Päivi Honkatukia, a Finnish name, in Tampere. But again, this can be found, and they're working on this, like as we speak, specifically around young people and contested consent, as they call it in COCO. Okay, any other comments or questions or reflections whatsoever, however broad? I mean, I think one thing that's worth thinking about, as Eva, I guess, was indicating, is that some things are not really talked about in terms of men and masculinities, even though people know that the particular kind of violence that one's talking about is clearly a lot to do with men and masculinities. You follow me? Even whether we're talking about in science and research or whether we're talking about in the media. You can't really discuss war without discussing men and masculinities, actually, but people do. You can't discuss something like, I don't know, football hooliganism, I don't know, football violence without discussing that, but people sometimes do.
There is a question in chat. I will read that for you, Jeff. It's from Zuzana Sekeráková-Boríková, my colleague sociologist. You have mentioned linking of violence and care and love in interviews with men.
Yeah.
Zuzana wonders whether you could tell us more about how and why are these related. And maybe Zuzana, you can add anything if you like.
I'm interested in care, like in care specifically, and the power and the usage of power and control in care are very interesting for me. And this is something I would love to hear about more. And I'm interested in about your ideas that how are those related? Why love and care can be seen as explanation or legitimation of violence. So
again, it's a really important and big question. I think you've sort of picked up on. I mean, perhaps to begin with the quote that I read out. It was not a very typical quote, actually. Okay. I mean, I had to, I just gave 2 examples that were rather different, you know what I mean, just for the purposes today. But it was an interesting one, I think, because I think it expressed one, you might say, sort of scenario or theme in a very particular, like graphic way, in a more explicit way than most of the other references to caring in the broadest sense for the woman concerned, particularly, say, men who were talking about, say, a previous relationship, that they still cared or they still loved the woman, but it had all ended and it had gone wrong, so to speak. But this was a quote that was very explicit in the way that you heard. But I think there is a much more general issue, which I guess is what you're hinting at. I mean, whether we're talking about the relationship of love again, love in the broad sense, not necessarily romantic love, but love and, well, let's call it patriarchy and violence. And my colleague in Örebro, who's now emerita, Anna Jónsdóttir, who's also originally Icelandic, but she's been in Sweden many, many years. I mean, she's written specifically on the place of love in patriarchal relations. I mean, not to sort of dismiss cynically all forms of love, but love is part of the sort of gender relations, you might say, or asymmetrical gender relations within patriarchal or some patriarchal relations. So Anna Jónsdóttir's work, I think, is actually a sort of more theoretical take on
Anna, I'm sorry, I haven't catch the name.
Anna, right, that's easy. Anna, yeah.
Yes.
Jónsdóttir, so it's Jonas Dottir, D-O-T-T-I-R.
Dottir, yes, it's Icelandic, yes.
But there are accents on the O, so it's complicated. Anyway, but I mean, she's worked, you know, for decades at a theoretical level about the place of love in gender relations and patriarchy. But I think, I mean, more generally, I think the issue of, I mean, many of the men did talk about sort of wanting to be in a caring relationship. So, and this is contradictory, but also, of course, there are many other forms of care. I mean, I also work on age, and care for older people, of course, is a site where there can also be violence, whether it's violence by the carer, so-called carer, or also violence by the cared for person towards the carer. Do you see? I mean, and this can be both individual or more domestic, like in someone's home, or it can be in a more institutional context, like a so-called care home. And in English, the term care home is particularly ironic. I mean, because there are quite a lot of studies that, certainly in the UK, that have reported on violence within care homes, meaning institutional homes. So I think there are a lot of different levels and angles on this, not to be, say, totally cynical, but care, in a sense, complicates, putting it mildly, the enactment of violence and creates also issues perhaps around the problem of actually leaving violence as well in some cases, because as we know, I mean, many women who've experienced violence also themselves may care or even love the man who has been violent or is being violent to them. So leaving is not a sort of straightforward and simple sort of decision, even putting aside the economic and material aspects of leaving and finding a new home, which is very difficult in some places. Perhaps the last thing I'll say on this is that, and again, it goes back to Eva's earlier comment, is that a lot of the earlier work in this field, you might say, has been done on violence against women and women's experience of violence, but actually there is now quite a lot of work on men and masculinity. There's quite a lot in terms of violence against women. But that was sort of succeeded and followed. And even now, as I say, it's not always the issue that is highlighted. And there is, to pick up on Michael Flood's final comment there, if you see it again, there is a kind of ambiguity or a contradiction about researching and also policy development around this, whilst at the same time not sort of taking over the field, if you follow me, not sort of prioritizing research on men, masculinities, above the research and the policy development on women and women's experiences and also women's violence, of course, as well, in some cases, obviously. Any other comments or what you...
Sorry, I think we should kind of move on.
Yeah, okay, yeah, that's fine. Is that all right? I mean, this is a bit, one has to improvise in these situations that we're now all used to, I guess, sort of used to, but not used to. Okay, well, the second part of what I was going to talk about, and again, if Ava, you can watch the time, I'm actually going to talk about two different related bits. The first is on ICT, information communication technologies and digital violence. And this is mainly deriving from work with Matthew Hall, including the book, which is called Revenge Pornography, which is a bad title, but I'll come back to that, published 3 or 4 years ago. And then a bit more on upskirting, which is a bit different, actually, in some ways. And actually, I'll just say, just to be a bit more sort of direct and personal, I think I mentioned that I'd worked with Wendy Parkin for a long time, in fact, since 1978, and we just published a book on age, but we've also worked on things like sexual harassment and sexuality in organizations and so on. And we wrote a book in 2001, or we published it in 2001. We wrote it obviously earlier. And there's a book which was called, you probably can't see it very well, Gender, Sexuality and Violence in Organizations. So this was an organizational study. And in the late 90s, we realized we had to do a chapter, which was, we'd done most of the book. And then we realized we had to do a chapter that was on global and transnational issues, not least the place of the internet and violence and the sex trade. And in the late 90s, or in the middle 90s even, this was in the process of transformation, actually. So the sex trade was being, you could say, revolutionized historically, moving from in real life to online. So we wrote this, one of the end chapters of the book around this issue and highlighting how the online world has certain features: time, space, compression, instantaneous. You can send an email to Australia and it will arrive in a few seconds. Reproducibility, images can be reproduced. The blurring of the real and the representational, portability, personalization, blurring online or offline. So at the time in the late 90s, this was kind of like relatively novel. And I've been interested in this area since. Okay. So then one thinks about how does this link on to violence against women? Domestic violence, this is often called, or men's violence to known women, and different kinds of technology. Okay, so this is about the place of technology. Technology in the broadest sense of the word. Technology can be anything from, I don't know, a biro, to a table, but also the body can be a technology as well. So much of the earlier work I've been talking about is the use of the body as a technology: arms, hands, fists, head, feet, kicking people, right? Use of weapons, sticks, guns, what was called less purpose-built items, kitchen equipment, throwing saucepans, telephones, as well as less directly forms of control of friends, family, and so on. Okay, but online violence is a bit different. It goes a step further, and it's the use of these sort of non-immediate technologies and affordances, such as listed here. Follow me. Okay, so we're now talking not about things that are happening in real life, but things that are happening online, which create different possibilities for violence and violation. Okay. So now, as we know, that there is a vast array of technologies. Fax sounds very old-fashioned. Email, net harassment, spyware, cyberstalking, online surveillance, image abuse, revenge porn, which is a bad word. And so even things like examples of, say, an ex-partner sending a tiny amount of money on a bank statement with an abusive message. Does that make sense? So you transfer like a few cents or a few pence to your ex-partner, but you add an abusive message on the bank statement, right? As well as things like the doxing and impersonation and the Internet of Things. So there's a vast range of technologies now available, which can be used in different ways. And these are just two examples. Refuge, the UK domestic violence charity, did a study of its service users, and 72% had experienced abuse through technology, or at least what they're calling technology in this sort of ICT sense, if you understand. If you'd have talked to people in refuge, 20 years earlier, you'd have had a very different set of results. Women's Aid, which is the sort of main UK overarching women's organisation dealing with violence from men or interpersonal violence particularly, 85% of respondents surveyed in 2015 reported abuse they'd received online from an ex-partner was a pattern of abuse experienced offline. So there's this continuation of offline abuse into online abuse. And there's a whole discussion then again about wording and naming. I didn't say in the first part that what words one uses in this area are important. So in Finnish, there's an established term, perheväkivalta, which means family violence, which is different to talking about domestic violence or wife battering or spousal abuse or whatever. So different terms have different connotations. And similarly, you're talking about online violence, there are many different terms that are in the literature. This is something Matthew Hall and Ruth Lewis and I are working on now, actually. So some people talk about technologically facilitated abuse or technologically related abuse or violence and so on. Okay, so to be a bit more specific, we produced, Matthew Hall and I produced this book in 2017 called Revenge Pornography. We did it fairly quickly because it was very much something that was becoming more talked about culturally and in media and so on. And we also, at the beginning of the book, wrote a kind of, I guess you could say, a kind of apology, because revenge pornography is a very bad term. But we decided after a lot of debate to use it because it was the term that was in cultural use. But it's very bad because what we're talking about isn't always about revenge, and it's certainly not always about pornography either, but it's about non-consensual sharing or distribution of images and text, sometimes called image-based sexual abuse. And there are different definitions of this, both legally or semi-legally or in research. So the posting of nude or sexually explicit photographs or videos of people online without their consent. That's very, so non-consensual is, and this goes back to the question that Veronica commented on or asked earlier, even if the photograph or video itself was taken with consent. And this is about uploading by ex-partners, partners, others, hackers sometimes, with the intention to taunt, shame, embarrass, etc., the pictured person or persons. And this is very much an activity done against women. In one study, which now is a bit old, 90% of the victims or survivors were women, but mainly of younger years. But that may be changing, actually, in fact, as people age, actually. And that's another question, which I think is worth for research. The age or generational aspects of digital online violence and violation, I think are quite important, or very important. Yeah, this is just some other figures. I don't know if this is perhaps again, an old study about to what extent the receiving of explicit photos on phones in sense has become relatively normalized in some circles. The FRA study I mentioned earlier, the wide EU study on violence against women, also did work on online violence. And in that study, about just 11%, 1 in 10, had received unwanted, offensive, sexually explicit emails or SMSs, or offensive advances, etc. And the highest figures actually were in Denmark and Sweden and Slovakia. and Netherlands. But as I said earlier briefly, there's a whole set of critiques of the FRA. If anyone's interested in that, I can put you in touch with literature on that, because the way it was conducted was different in different parts of Europe. And also there's a huge question how, to what extent the context in which people answer those kind of questions is different in different parts of Europe. I'll leave it at that, actually, I think. Okay, what Matthew and I did, and Matthew is mainly a discourse theorist, which I'm not particularly, although I'm interested in discourse, obviously, did an analysis of a particular website or platform called myex.com, which appeared, at least that time, to be the largest dedicated revenge porn website with over 12,500 images in 2017. So it was a large lot of data, basically. And what we, or largely he did, and I did other parts of the study, was to analyze the texts, the written text, not the visuals. So we didn't actually look at the visuals. There's lots of issues around ethics as well, of course, here in studying this kind of material. And looked also at the discourses around masculinity amongst the men who, so-called posters, the men who post, right? And we also looked at men, women, and women, and so on. I think I might skip over this. This is like just numbers, but I mean, sorry, it's different kinds of central discourses, but very, very 90% really by men, mainly heterosexual men, and a minority of heterosexual women posting these non-consensual texts or visuals, and a very small number of gay and lesbian, actually, very, very small indeed. And then we looked at the discourses in more detail, and this is described in the book called Revenge Pornography, with a bad title. And these were, simplifying a lot, these were perhaps 5 major discourses. One was intimate relationship control, including over other men, which is kind of interesting. I think I may come back to that in a minute. The sexualizing and objectifying of women, including partners and ex-partners, heterosexual promiscuity and infidelity, usually highlighted by the women, the link with money and power, and also perhaps a bit surprisingly around loss of fatherhood, actually, and parenthood, which was perhaps more prominent than we expected. And this is where now I have to also now, give a kind of warning. This is some extracts which are undoubtedly meant to be offensive, not by me, but they're just examples of some of the kinds of things written in this dedicated site. Interrelationship control. Recently broke up because I was too controlling, apparently. Well, I couldn't check her phone and tell her to close her Facebook, and didn't flirt with every other guy. As she's now done with me, not finished now, I keep pointing these to myself, okay. So the idea of being sort of too controlling is interesting, I think, in this context, as if a certain amount of controlling is acceptable. This is a really nasty thing, sexualizing women and promiscuity. This waste, misspelt, but that's by the way, of oxygen is my ex of 15 years. She has been cocked more times than John Wayne's gun, so it's supposed humor, supposed. She's been shot over more times than Baghdad, also adding racism in as well, also misspelt. She has seen more loads than your mum's washing machine, enter at your own risk. So it's like boastful of sexual activity and his own partner's infidelity. This is the kind of tone of some of these posts, as they're called. Money and power. This woman is a nasty, lying piece of work. She led me on to bleed me dry of money, then put me into false sense of security, then abandoned me when I was ill. I now have panic disorder and anxiety from what she put me through. And then this lost fatherhood, my slut ex who has ruined my life. She took my kids, ruined my life, and now bitches about me to everyone since the divorce. I'd recommend the work by Wisnant, by the way, on this, people interested in this, who's done a very interesting chapter on this, on online discourses around these kinds of ways of extending violence into the digital world, which of course then can be passed around the world with no consent whatsoever. So, I mean, what one has here is that most of the men posting sort of claimed the women deserved this kind of posting as legitimate revenge, often position themselves as wronged victims, like a reversal, so to speak. You could say an ideological reversal, and positioning the ex-woman as the perpetrator of some kind of abuse to them. And then the way these were talked about was highly masculized, highly hierarchical, heterosexualized, intimate, as well as linking with fatherhood and money in some cases. And often this loss of personal power seen as a kind of emasculation. And the revenge is reported as supposedly equalizing in that situation. I mentioned about other men being involved sometimes, and this also relates to the direct physical violence, because one of the ways in which sometimes men attack women is also by attacking another man who might be the current partner. That's another issue. So violence to women can also violence between or to men. There's a lot of issues about situating revenge porn and image abuse. But I think one of the main things here in the middle of this PowerPoint, there's three things in bold that I'd highlight. One is the homosocial exchange between men that's going on, and who are the imagined audiences of this kind of posting, both textual posting and visual posting, and also as a kind of access to information and sexual evaluation of women. There's a homosocial audience in these kind of sites. It's another form of gender violence and abuse, but also there's what we call micro-techno-masculinities, sort of at the fingertips, if you like. This is not just about the use of, say, occupying space, like, so using the body to block someone moving in a house. This is like masculinity in the fingertips, in the sort of techno enactment. There's a lot of debate about what can be done, and even since we wrote this, there's been a lot of developments legally and regulatory. The first country to make this kind of thing illegal was the Philippines, I think. But now there's a lot of debates going on, including in the EU. In the UK, there's a major law reform process going on, which actually Matthew and Ruth and I have contributed to a bit, amongst many others. In a very small way we contributed. There's also issues around the technology as well, and the action, if you like, against websites and against, well, Facebook and Twitter and those kinds of organizations, which were a bit slow, putting it mildly, to realize how people were using their platforms. There's obviously issues around awareness raising, schools, education, media, victim support, maybe men's programs. And then there's a massive issues around online politics, feminist online politics. And there are many fantastic feminist sites engaging with and against this kind of development. Okay, that's a quick snapshot on so-called revenge pornography, but image abuse. But the thing I want to then move on to swiftly, if I may, Matthew and Ruth and I, well, actually, I met Ruth Lewis, first time probably 25, maybe 30 years ago even, in the UK. And then we actually met again at a conference on violence in Helsinki in 2019, I think. And basically we were all realized we were working together. So we were working on upskirting, again, in inverted commas. And I assume you know what that means, but if you don't, it means the taking of photographs or videos, usually of women, well, yeah, without consent, I think you can fairly say, often in public places, sometimes literally up the skirts, but also other parts of the body, which are violating bodily integrity or privacy or whatever, or personal space, or sexuality in some cases. And we've just published an article which is online, violence against women, which is called Upskirting, Homosociality and Craftsmanship. So, and again, the issue of homosociality is very important here, actually. And the upskirting issue is a little bit different to what I've been saying so far. Not totally different, obviously, but a bit different. So yeah, this is what I've just been saying. With the aid of technology, smartphones, various kinds of cameras, what used to be called voyeurs can now take photos and recordings, also sound recordings as well, unobtrusively. So the act of taking photographs of different parts of the body without consent, usually without knowledge, often in public, generally in public, even on public transport, in shopping malls, for instance, even at work or at leisure sites like a gym or something like that. And also, of course, not only the taking, but also the sharing and distribution, and arguably also the consumption. And this is a big issue, of course, in legal controls. What is included? Is it just the taking? Just, I used the word just there, but is it also the sharing of distribution, or is it the consuming? And the control of this is obviously very difficult, to say the least. What we did here, and again, Matthew did most of the basic and textual analysis, was of a platform, a dedicated website platform called the Candid Zone, which doesn't exist now, as far as I know. It was founded in 2018 and had, in middle of 2019, 28,000 specific threads and more than 500,000 posts. Posts, I mean textual posts, written posts. It was wiped by the owner at the end of 2019. And in this site, posts, both written posts and visual posts can be rated by viewers and commented on, okay? So you can get thumbs up and thumb down, so to speak, and so you can see the most popular. So upskirting becomes a performance of masculinity which reproduces, or is reproduced by homosocial bonds. There were rules, so-called rules of members, you have to subscribe and so on. You must follow certain rules, too old, too young, not attractive. Let's keep this website full of hot girls, etc. No personal information, no pornography, no voyeur content like in toilets and so on. No suggested involving minors, children. The most popular, so-called popular post had this title. You may want to sit down for this one, with 1,000 comments, over 1,000 comments and 35 views. So this is what we analyzed. And these were the themes around homosociality and what we called eventually craftsmanship, which might sound again a strange term. The homosociality perhaps is not so surprising: gratitude, respect, courage, envy, and advice. But the craftsmanship was perhaps a bit different to what we expected. So yeah, so in terms of the homosociality and respect, this is 2 examples. Standing ovation for you, sir, well done. Very well done. Hundreds of ups for you. Bravo, absolutely superb work. The quality of the subject and the video is outstanding. Well done. And thanks much for this amazing contribution. It will go down in history as one of the greats. And then in terms of the more so-called craftsmanship, which I think we got, it sounds, as researchers, we got somehow more interested in this as something different, where there was a lot of comment on the skills of the poster. So this is certainly a kind of violence or violation or abuse, but it's also contextualized in this case within a kind of craftsmanship discourse or frame. Good, I thought I was seeing that. Excellent capture of perfect body and perfect beauty, A+, simply superb piece of work from you. This is one of the best original, OC I think is original content, not borrowed from someone else or reposted, works here. Perfect subject, long leg, awesome, and so on. Anyway, looking forward to more contributions like this from you. Thanks for sharing. So in this article, which you can find online, and I think a version was sent to you before the session, I think, an earlier version, this involves both reinforcing and breaking certain gender norms. It involves both reinforcing, you say, patriarchal norms, but also transgressing also at the same time. That's the phone call I'm getting rid of. It involves dehumanizing women, it crossing certain boundaries, invasion of women's space and body, at least visually. But it's also accompanied in the posting by this supposedly polite, serious, sometimes very serious normalization. And we ended up calling this polite misogyny. I mean, we discussed this quite a lot, actually. Is that a good term? And we have to sort of qualify that in the article, explaining the word polite even can mean different things. It was polite between men, but of course it was very impolite or abusive to the women. So this was an attempt to capture what was happening on this particular Candid Zone site. And we also made a comment, which might sound odd, I don't know, a parallel with practice of hunting and killing animals, where, you know, the display of trophies is appreciated and admired, and even as evidence of courage, skill, and even civilization. Which is like, so this was a kind of, it was like a men's room, but a kind of polite, photographic men's room with an appreciation of these skills, which is a bit different to the myx.com, as you saw earlier, with these really explicitly, clearly sort of graphic language of direct abuse to the woman, like some of the quotes that I read through in the previous revenge porn study. Okay, so this creates a somewhat different, perhaps, angle, but I think it's worthy of, and this may, of course, develop, and there are new forms of online life or online violence developing all the time, not least deep fakes, and the use of the Internet of Things, which I think is an area that will grow, unfortunately, in the coming years, very unfortunately. So the question here, just sparking off, is how do information communication technologies, and there are so many different versions of this, how do they change thinking about men and masculinities' relations to violence or violation and abuse, both in a research sense, you know, but also within a policy sense, or in a legal sense, or in a sort of practical everyday life sense, you know, where people can obviously record each other without permission, even, you know, sound record or even visual record without permission in a way that was not really commonplace, even, should we say, in the, I don't know, even the mid-90s, perhaps. That wasn't really something that happens so very much, but now it can be routine. So this is, yeah, I'll stop that point and hand it back to Eva to take us through what time we have. We have quite a bit of time, I think, or some time at least.
Thank you, Jeff. Brilliant. I just made a note from your last slide that relates to the research of upskirting on the polite misogyny.
Yeah.
I think that's something that really touches the point and practice that we are quite familiar with in the Czech context, where the strength of the essentializing discourse of gender relations is still very strong. Like it's natural for men to post sexually explicit or otherwise erotic pictures of women, because that's their nature, and it's very difficult for women to discuss these issues, and for feminists not to be targeted as those who do not understand sex or just want to ruin the world as we know it. So I wonder what you are familiar with many more cultural contexts than I am. When did these debates started in Finland, UK, or other countries on this polite misogyny, or how far has the dialogue on political correctness, but also on socially constructed rather than essentialist gender relations change the discourse? Well, whatever you have to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are there are two things here, well, probably many things, but I mean, the whole debate, as you say, around how gender or sex and gender, as you probably know, I like the word gex actually as well, which combines sex and gender, but perhaps that's a different discussion. But I mean, this is obviously a very, very long running debate, both within feminism and sort of gender discussions, I mean, or queer discussions or transgender discussions, but also, of course, in general society. I mean, general politics in the broad sense of the term, or general media debate. And yeah, the example about naturalizing sex and gender, or well, naturalizing maybe sex is a more accurate way of putting it. Yeah, I think, well, it varies. I mean, it varies in these different ways historically. So, and it's been, yeah, you could say, reaffirmed in recent years in certain parts of the world very strongly, perhaps compared with even 10, 15 years ago, perhaps even. And I think it's linked to more general issues around religion and, well, I'll use the word right-wing politics. I mean, it may not be an ideal term, but these kinds, and migration issues as well. So, I mean, I think that's a very broad set of debates indeed, which in some ways I don't think are necessarily linked to the online world. I mean, that maybe they've become accentuated through the online world, because obviously the online world has created this possibility to, in a sense, create or live in your own so-called bubble, as it's been now labeled, your own sort of community of like-minded or like-thinking people in a way that wasn't quite the same, as I say, even in the mid-1990s. But I mean, the specific notion of polite misogyny, which we're using in this particular study, I mean, I don't think we'd come across that term in this way. I think we invented it. I think in this, as far as we know, it was trying to capture this, and it's so different. Well, it appears so different to the quotes that I was reading out from the revenge pornography examples, you know, which are so graphically violating. Whereas here, the tension is being turned to the man, the photographer, if you like, or the visual artist almost, really, and the appreciation of that between men specifically. So, I mean, you've got a different sort of range of debates here, from very broad things about what it means to be a natural woman or a natural mother, should we say, or a natural man or a natural father, even within different parts of Europe, as against this particular sort of instance in this particular candid zone, which of course is not unique, but it's a specific location, again, to use the term. And I say it reminds me, and that's why we use the word craftsmanship, of other kinds of situations where basically men spend a lot of time admiring each other's work. And one can think of one can think of sport as perhaps an obvious example where that happens a lot, whether it's in playing sport or watching sport. I mentioned Doug Balkmar earlier, who's part of this Violence Regimes project. He did his thesis on men and cars. It's called On Men and Cars. If you're interested, it's about men who love cars, basically. And the time and effort and energy and skill and expertise that is devoted. I mean, there are women involved in that field of activity, but it's very much men devoting their time to actually modify cars and then admire each other and give prizes to each other and so on. Anyway, so I think, yeah, I'm perhaps repeating it. I think one's got some very sort of different levels of analysis going on here, from very broad questions about, what is sex, what is gender, how is this constructed differently, well, just say within capitalism, within socialism, within post-socialism, whatever words you want to use, within left-wing or right-wing politics within mainstream media or alternative media. And then one has particular sites where this, what we tried to explain here, takes a different form to the other examples that I went through swiftly earlier. But maybe you want to comment yourself more on what you're thinking, really. I would be a bit cautious of making the equation, I suppose that's my thought, but maybe equation between the naturalization at a very general level of society and then the specific naturalization that's going on this candid zone site. Actually, I'll be a bit cautious about that myself, but I'm not sure.
Okay, yeah, thank you for these thoughts. I can see
thinking aloud, as they say, thinking aloud.
Okay. I can see there is another question. I will stop sharing your screen and ask the participants if you could switch on your cameras, those whose connection is okay, or she has just did it. And Nina Farova has a question.
Oh, hello, Nina. I know you.
Hi, Jeff. It's really nice to see you after some time.
Yeah.
I have one question because I'm interested in the intersection of men, masculinities, and technology. And do you think that technologies or Internet of Things are in some kind of reinforcing patriarchy? Like men are controlling technologies in the personal sense, like in home, and also in a broader sense, like in decision-making positions, they are controlling how we creating, using technologies and who can profit from technologies. So if these issues are coming to that, we are reinforcing patriarchy.
Yeah, I think, well, when I was trying to organize my PowerPoints, I don't know, sometime yesterday, I was trying to think what to leave in and leave out and so on. And one of the things was a more general sort of PowerPoint on the relevance of technology for thinking about men and masculinities more broadly. And because when you think about it, there are lots and lots and lots of connections. Putting to one side the candid zone or image, image-related sexual abuse or whatever. I mean, there are lots of issues. And some people even talk about techno-patriarchy as well. And I think this is something that should be engaged with very strongly. And in terms of the sort of, I would call it the subfield of studying men and masculinities critically, I think what's interesting there is that the sort of most influential work, and I mean Raymond Connor's work is undoubtedly, the most influential, I think that's fair to say, was developed initially in the late 70s, actually, late 1970s, when it was a bit of a different world, and so it wasn't old-fashioned, but it was a bit different in certain ways, or many ways. And then, of course, it's been revised and updated in work in the 80s, and then in the 90s and the 2000s, and so on. But the thing I wanted to say was that, I mean, for quite a few years, I was a bit frustrated how issues of well, actually, information technology were being neglected in the sort of subfield. I think issues of technology more generally have been taken up quite a lot, even from the 1970s and 1980s, actually. I mean, and Ulf Mellström, my colleague in Sweden, I'm not same university, different university, my colleague in another sense, has worked a lot on technology and men and machines, and Cynthia Coburn, written, who sadly now died a few years ago, wrote really important work on technology and masculinities in the 1980s. So, I mean, I think the general area of technology has been picked up, but information technology, I think many scholars were very slow, actually, very slow to pick up. This was what was going on, particularly for younger people. I mean, not only, obviously, but this is the life, clearly, for many people for the last, I don't know, say 15 years or so, particularly, or 20 years, hold on. Yeah, something like that. But now I think if you join sites like ResearchGate or Google or whatever, you get posts every day actually of studies on what's happening. So now I think this has changed, but it's only been, I would say, in the last 5 years or so that real change has taken place in the area of work. And I think there is a strong case for thinking about some relation of technology or techno-patriarchy, just as I think it's useful to talk about transnational patriarchies myself, where technologies are one of the drivers of that. But there's always a but. There's always a but in the sense that it's also become more complicated. And I think I'd recommend Winifred or Winnie Poster's work. It's a surprising name, Poster, right? Who's written quite a lot about how technology and men and masculinities is also shifting, for example, racialization to some extent as well. I mean, yeah, so it's not, yeah, so the place of, say, if you say South Asia is very different in the technology field to what it was 20, 30 years ago. And Winnie works in both India and US, and I'd recommend her work very strongly. So, I mean, that's one example. The Internet of Things, yeah, I mean, this actually worries me, particularly if I'm honest. Yeah, I think the Internet of Things, which I assume most people understand, this is basically the use of different objects, which could range from a car to a kettle, you know, or a television. So I was like, for use in different ways, which can be hacked or whatever, in theory at least. And this is a bit different to even talking about mobile phones or, you know, spy cameras and so on, because the object is, or it can be toys even. It can be a furry toy that can have a microphone installed. So this is a bit different to the more obvious uses, and I think is one of the most worrying developments, and is obviously a big challenge also for lawyers and people interested in this. And I think it does actually suggest there has to be more action with technology companies and providers of various kinds, actually, directly. It can't only be left to after the event to be controlled or regulated by lawyers and national governments or even internationally. I think it has to engage. And there are some companies that are beginning to do that, I think, you know, I don't want to name particular companies, but there are some companies that are doing, you could say, good work at that level, which obviously involves people who are technologists, engineers, and not only people who are, say, lawyers or politicians. Yeah, but broadly, I think you've raised an important point. I mean, you've got to bear in mind, a lot of studies in this area are always behind the times. I think, you know, in any area where there's technological or rapid technological development, I mean, you could say the whole area of STS studies is always a bit behind. And that's where, if you've got any friendly technologists or engineers or IT experts, it's really good to work with them, actually.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, I went on too long, sorry. Yeah, sorry.
That's fine.
Nice to see you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for the question and for the reply. Our time is almost up, but we definitely have... Oh yeah,
sorry about that. Yes,
that's why we have you here. That's perfect.
Yeah.
Any last questions or comments or points from any one of you? Just
to remind you, if there's something specific, particularly if I've mentioned something quickly, like a reference, and just email me and I'll send, particularly I think it was, well, Veronica mentioned these questions, which are hard to summarize, you know. So just send an email or send it via Eva if you want to. Yeah, I can just try and answer some quick link or whatever. Oh, now I can see the chat, so I didn't see it before, yeah. Yeah,
there's not much in the chat. We made the use of the visual part of the screening.
Yeah, yeah.
I do not see any hands up or any mic unmuted. I have one technical last thing. Jeff, would that be okay for you if I shared your PowerPoint with the students enrolled in the class and those who participate here today?
Yeah. And just to explain, there was the batch of PowerPoints that I zipped through quickly, you know, obviously. But there were some other ones at the end, which were just things that you can just delete them. I mean, there were bits and pieces that I thought if things came up, I mean, they're not secret, but they will be a bit confusing. They're a bit random. So unless someone's particularly interested in something that you know of, Eva, then just delete the ones at the end. That's fine. That's no problem.
Okay, I will do that. I think we can stop recording.